Well, we've been running a very special series. We are calling it the Heritage Series, where we are talking to those who we know that God has used greatly in the spreading of the gospel. This message of the three angels has gone around the world. It's continuing to go around the world. And some of these individuals that we are talking to have been those that have really been right on the cutting edge of proclaiming the gospel. And the one we're going to be speaking to today is Elder C.D. Brooks. Wonderful man, isn't he, C.A.?
He is an extremely godly man. Yes. Now, of the three, this is the third in our series. We've had E.E. Cleveland, powerful man of God, as you well know. And Elder Bradford was just talking with him just yesterday, and he was saying the amount of calls and cards and well wishes he got when we aired his particular life story, which was powerful because his mother, as he said, knew Ellen White and was on the Morning Star boat with Edson. Now we come to C.D. Brooks, and the thing that jumps out at you about Elder Brooks is his humility. He is a humble guy, and I was reading just yesterday where Ellen White was saying to have ability without humility doesn't really make you a powerful tool in the hand of God. It's the ability and the humility combined that makes you a force for God. And this is a man who combines great ability with great humility.
And this is genuine humility.
Yes.
Not the phony type.
No.
You know, we can't always spot the phony type, but God can. And genuine humility may be a very outgoing person. I know of individuals, and I can name some, that are just so open and wide and outgoing, and people might look at them and think they're not humble. But if they really knew them, they know that they are genuinely, have a genuine humility.
Yes.
And someone else may be very quiet and very staid and sit back, and you may say, well, that person is so humble, and there may be a terrible pride within him. But in Elder Brooks, we see a humility that was willing to put himself on the line. Go out there in an evangelistic meeting and put that poster out. Your influence is on the line. Everything is on the line. And you go into a place, hold a meeting, knowing that these meetings can totally fail and you can be an embarrassment. But he would go time after time again, and God would bless him in those meetings.
The thing that impresses me about Elder Brooks, of course I've known him a number of years, as have you.
Yes.
He did a great meeting in New York in 1992 in Brooklyn. But when we had him come to New York City, you flew in, I flew in, we were there, and I picked him up at the train station. Now, we brought him into Grand Central Station, New York City. Humongous train station. And the problem was that 3 trains came in at the same time. One was delayed because of a storm. His train and the train behind him actually was early. So all 3 trains came in. And they were changing tracks because they had to reroute trains. So I'm looking on a board trying to find C.D. Brooks, his train, and they switched tracks. So I'm at this track over here, and of course he is over there. And by the time I get to the station master to find out, he's been in the station maybe 15, 20 minutes. Well, I'm thinking, oh boy, he's there with his wife, running around this massive train station, thousands of people, and I can't find him. So I don't know what to expect. And I turn around to run to his train, and I run right into him, smack right into him. And of course he's kind and gracious, and I was ready for an explosion. And of course he was just CD. He said, CA, it's okay. It's okay. I know the trains got rerouted, and I saw that mass of people. I said, how's he ever going to find us in this train station with thousands of people? But he was gracious and kind, and he gave a fine, godly interview, as you recall.
Oh, very much so. And I reminded him of a time we were at Berkshire years ago with all the different evangelists, and we were talking about ways of increasing attendance and holding the attendance that you get. And different individuals were talking about, like the Bible gift plan, and others had things that they gave away. I made a presentation on something that I was giving away. I remember that. Elder Brooks simply looked at us when we said, what are you doing? He said, I get on my knees with the Word of God. And he said, I pray and I study. And he said, I am so on fire when I hit that pulpit that people come night by night to watch this preacher burn with the power of the Holy Spirit. And so it was a chastisement a little bit to those of us, but I have never forgotten that. And it made a big impression upon me to spend more time in study,
Yes.
more time in
Yes.
prayer,
Yes.
and depending more on the Holy Spirit for the results that we have.
Well, not only was he the speaker for Breath of Life for many, many years, but of course he held evangelistic crusades.
Oh, yes.
And there are a number of churches around the country that are Breath of Life churches that are a result of meetings that he had.
True, and also correct, as a friend of mine says. And and you know that some of those churches have just grown profoundly, and he's going to be sharing some of those experiences with us in our interview. I will never forget that day. There are some days that, you know, just kind of melt into all the others and you don't recall them.
Yeah.
But I'll never forget that day just because we had that opportunity to visit with this man.
Yeah, beautiful new church,
Yeah.
you recall. And your wife and Walter and Brooks were sitting, and a couple pastors came. They
Right.
just heard that C.D. Brooks was going to be interviewed, and they just appeared.
Yes.
And they became our audience that day, but it was a fabulous interview.
It was. And you know, the amazing thing to me is that when these men have completed and come down to the twilight years of their ministry, Elder Brooks, Elder Cleveland, Elder Bradford, so many times our leaders kind of melt off into the sunset. We never hear from them again. I'm so thankful for the Leadership Center that is located at Oakwood,
Yes,
that is
yes.
named in after these three men, the Brooks, Bradford, Cleveland
Yes.
Leadership
Center, sure.
And our good friend
Harold Lee.
Harold Lee
Yeah.
is the man
Yeah.
who is in charge and has had a great deal to do with this. And I thank you, Harold, for having doing all that you've done to make this a reality.
Yeah, it's fabulous. You know, I am glad, Jim, that we've had the chance to get these guys on tape.
Yes.
And get their stories. And, you know, we're not wishing anybody any ill will, but they are retired, getting up in age. I think Cleveland is the oldest, Bradford next, and Brooks may be the youngest of the three. But all have retired. Elder Brooks does not fly anymore because he has some heart issues, and I'm glad we were able to record these stories before they got a little too old. And I almost want to peek. We've got a couple sort of waiting in the wings. We've got
Yes.
one. We've booked him already.
Yes.
We're going to be interviewing him in just a little bit.
Yeah, we might as well tell who that is.
yeah.
That's Ron Halverson.
Ron Halverson, yes.
And so Ron will be on the way.
He'll
We
be
have
next up.
another former General Conference president that we're negotiating with, and hope that we're able to put that together.
This is good stuff, Jim.
It
It's
is.
exciting. It is.
And if you love this church, and I do, and you love this message, and you know these individuals that have been so involved in the history of this church, particularly, say, from the 50s on.
Oh, yes.
The last half century of this denomination, it is really, really exciting to talk to them.
Truly is.
Yeah.
All righty, let's go. Let's go.
All
to it.
right, let's go. Well, hello and welcome. We're coming to you from New York City at the North Bronx Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we're just so happy that we can be with you. And today we continue our Heritage Series, and we're talking to Pastor C.D. Brooks. Elder Brooks, we welcome you, and we're so happy that we can be with you. And C.A. Murray is joining with me, and we are going to be talking to this man who God has used in such a tremendous way. He's had a fabulous ministry. He's the founder of the Breath of Life television program, which we see regularly on 3ABN and is seen in networks around the world. So we're so happy to be visiting with Elder C.D. Brooks today. And Elder Brooks, we want to ask a question of you, and we want to talk to you. Tell us a little bit about your background, your family, and where you come from and so forth.
Well, obviously, when we get into that, we're going way back.
Yeah.
I believe that my grandparents were born before the Civil War ended. And out of that period of stress, two families lived separately and quite differently. My father's parents were very poor. And when he was 9 years old, his daddy went off to work on the railroads, and they never saw him again. He died of pneumonia. My mother's parents were well-to-do if you can understand how I mean that for those days. He owned a store, a general store, and he owned lots of land and was a minister in the Methodist Church. And that's the part I wanted to get to. My background as a minister goes back into the Methodist Church. We were all Methodists. Not only was he a Methodist minister, but his two sons were Methodist ministers and professors in the school system at that time. Dad went to work for my mother's father, and that's how the family was brought together. He married one of the daughters.
I see.
But that was our background. I didn't know any of them. My grandfather, who was a minister, died in 1920, a bit before my time. But that's sort of the background. A religious family, strong and respected.
What part of the country was this that you lived in?
In North Carolina.
All right.
I was born in Greensboro, and of course the families began about 50 miles away in Chatham County. And I was one of 11 siblings. I tease people a little by telling them I was the tithe, the 10th in the group. And I didn't have to take care of any little ones. The rest of them had to take care of me. But we were a loving family, and for those of us who remain, we still are very close.
Mm-hmm. It is said, Elder, that beneath every Adventist there is a Methodist, that, down there somewhere, because our doctrinal package is so much similar. You grew up obviously in a Christian home, but not an Adventist home. How did Adventism make its way into your family?
Just before I answer that, I would like to tell you that when I was 6 years old, I had a Sunday school class in the Methodist Church. And then when I answer the question, you'll see why I was terminated. I was born in July, and the same year, in December, my mother was admitted to the Catholic Hospital, St. Leo's Catholic Hospital in Greensboro. And the family was told she would not survive. Now, I'm 6 months old, but these stories came on to me. Mother told me herself. And the family was really preparing for her demise, when suddenly in her hospital room there came a powerful shining light. And a voice spoke to her out of that light, called her by her first name, and said to her, "Mattie, I want you to keep my commandments." Well, Mother had been a Christian all her life. Her father, a minister, her brothers, ministers, and the whole family involved in the church. So she said, "Well, Lord, which one am I not keeping?" And he showed her the fourth commandment. He didn't explain it, just showed it to her. And it was obvious to her this was the Sabbath command, the seventh day of the week. And she said, "But Lord, my friends don't know this. My family doesn't know this. If I'm going to die, let me leave a testimony so they will know and they will believe." And the Lord said, "I want living sacrifices." And the vision dissipated. And in a few days, Mother was combing her own hair and sitting up and walking around, and lived to see me baptizing souls in the pool. But we had no church, and this is very significant. We had no church, we had no teacher, we had no literature, not even a pamphlet, so we didn't know how to do anything. Mother kept Sabbath. God could have told her about sunset, but he didn't. So at 10 o'clock Friday night, Mother would be baking and scrubbing and getting ready for midnight.
Oh, bless her.
When I was 6 years old, now I can remember this, the church had become very dissatisfied with all of us. And that's how I lost my job as Sunday school teacher. And they organized a committee to save Mother because she was valuable, a hard worker. My mother was an unobtrusive type. She wouldn't argue. She was gentle. She was a deeply spiritual woman. The committee was coming, and they were all friends. There was no hostility. And on a beautiful Sunday afternoon, They gathered in a room and were seated around a table, and the head deacon was in charge, Mr. Walter Holt, and a good man, good neighbor. And I'm a little 6-year-old standing off in the corner wanting to hear every bit of this. And the chairman said to her, Sister Brooks, why can't you understand that you are leading your family back into bondage? The law has been nailed to the cross. You don't have to consider it. Anything in it that is burdensome, you are free from. You don't have to do it. Why can't you understand that? And I never shall forget Mother's question. She opened her Bible, and St. Paul spoke for her. She said, Sir, if that's true, then explain this text to me. Where there is no law, there is no transgression. And then she turned to John. Sin is the transgression of the law. Before he could recover from her questions, she added this that I thought was classic. She said, you know that beautiful lamp you have in your home? One day while you are gone, I'll just come over and steal it. And if there is no law, I have not done wrong. They decided to end the meeting, and they left as friends. Mother walked with them to the car, but Mr. Holt handed her a package. And he said, since you believe that, I want to give you a gift. And she went out with them, and they got in their cars. She came back in, handed me a pair of scissors, and she said, son, open this. See what it is. It was about that thick, and it was heavy. And when I cut it open, there was an old illustrated copy of The Great Controversy by someone named E.G. White. A miracle.
Oh, man.
Many years later, we baptized into our church the sister of Mr. Holt, an elderly woman. And we asked her, where did he get that? She said, I remember as a child, a book salesman came going house to house, and Dad thought this would be a wonderful thing, and he bought it, but once he got into it, he didn't like it, so he put it up on the shelf. I like to tell people God sent the colporteur to deliver a book for Mother.
That's right.
Amen.
I really believe that.
Oh, I do too.
And she was so diligent in keeping Sabbath. We had worship pretty much the way our folk do all the time now. She would call us together on Sabbath morning and always had a message for us, sometimes out of that book. And then we would sing and pray together. And we would repeat all the commandments. Now, the Methodists had a way of doing it. After each commandment, they'd say, Lord, have mercy upon us and incline our hearts to keep this law. And we children would do that. And then my dad was not a part of this. Now, he didn't fight it, but he would go off to work, and he left little chores for us to do. Not anything much, maybe rake the leaves off the yard. And Mother would say this to us, the same law that says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, says, honor your father. I admit I don't know how to handle this, but I believe that if you go out with your heart set on obeying God and keep him in your conversation, even as you rake the leaves, God will understand. That was a lot of wisdom for those days.
Great theology.
And because there was never this confrontation, we saw our dad baptized, and he became elder in the church. But we still don't have a church. And the community all belonged to the same church, Mount Carmel Mount Carmel Methodist Church. And eventually they got a little disgusted with our family. And they would say such awful things. They would say that Mother was leading us all to the insane asylum. And this was general. One day, Mother had me delivering groceries. Now, most people today don't know what the Great Depression was, but we had one. And people didn't have money or food. But we had large gardens and a huge farm. And she would be cutting cabbages and squash and tomatoes and cucumbers and all of these things, loading them onto a wheelbarrow. And she would ask me to deliver them. And when I got back, she had another load ready. To be honest with you, at about 9 years old, I was tired of pushing the wheelbarrow. So I decided on the way back from one of those trips, I was going to really chide my mother. And so I walked into the garden and I put the wheelbarrow down. And I said, Mom, I don't understand you. And she smiled. She said, well, son, what is it you don't understand? I said, these are the people who are saying all these rough things. You've got me delivering food to them. I don't get that. I don't understand that. If I live to be 100, brethren, I'll never forget. She raised up with a cutting knife and did this. And she said, son, Jesus said, render not evil for evil. Do good to them that despitefully use you. These lessons have stayed with me all my life. Well, I got to get to the answer to the question. One day, my sister, who was married to a Methodist minister, was at home doing her things, her chores, and there was a knock at the door. And a colporteur by the name of Willie White, an elderly man, introduced himself and asked if he could speak with her for a few minutes. And she invited him in. Now, my sister was more like me. As a matter of fact, she became one of my staff members and a soul winner all around the world. But she was a bit different than Mother. And she listened for a while, and being busy, became a little impatient. And she said to him, sir, I don't want to embarrass you in my house, but I really don't feel like listening to this. Well, he was shocked. Well, did I say something wrong? Did I offend you? No, it isn't that. She said, the problem is we religionists are making a lot over Jesus and how wonderful he is, and he is, but we are not obeying him. So he said, well, what do you mean by that? She said, number one, we're not keeping the true Sabbath. Oh, tell me about that. She said, every Sunday we go traipsing off to church. Sunday is not the Sabbath. He said, well, what day is the Sabbath? She said, the seventh day of the week is the Sabbath of the Lord, and that is Saturday. And yet we are not doing it generally anywhere. By that time, he was fairly laughing. And he said, my sister, how would you like to go to a church where everybody believes that? That was on Thursday. I got home in November. Mother was rejoicing. She told me about the experience. Tomorrow the pastor will be here. He did come. Sabbath we were in church. My mother, 6 sisters, and I walked into church. It wasn't a very impressive church like this one. It was a very humble church with a pot-bellied stove, no wall-to-wall carpet, no padded seats. But I remember looking around at 10 years of age, and I saw all of these people, very plain looking, and up in the youth choir box was a group of about 10 or 15 young people, but hanging over the pulpit was a sheet with all the 10 Commandments on it. I'm 10 years old, and an impression came to me as a voice and said, this is it. And in more than...
So it struck you right there. First time in a church, you felt it. You know
more than 60 years later, I haven't changed my mind.
No, that's right.
It was a miracle of God. And there's one other thing that was a miracle. This was getting late into the fall, and they announced a baptism first part of 1941. Mother said, oh, that's wonderful. We'll all be baptized. And we got this in our hearts. But the pastor, wisely, was trying to keep us off to be taught a little more. And finally, there was this sit-down confrontation with Mother, and he told her that. He said, Sister Brooks, I want you and your family to wait a while. She said, wait? We've waited for 10 years, and now that we've found the church, you're telling us to wait? And he began slowly to explain there are things you don't understand yet. I want you to be taught. She said, like what? Well, he had been to visit us many times, and when you came to our farm, you got the tour. You saw the horses, you saw the cows, you saw the chickens, and you saw the pigs, Poland, China pigs, the finest in the country. And ours at slaughter time were different than all the other because they were grain-fed. That Dad liked to show them off. And he would go down there and admire those pigs with my dad. But he said to Mother, God has some claims on us, temples of the Holy Spirit, and he's concerned about what we consume as food. What do you mean by that? He said, for instance, your family eats pork. That's the first time he'd ever mentioned it. And there are teachings, and she said, please show it to me. He turned to Leviticus and Deuteronomy and read it, and this was my mother's response. All right, what next?
Yeah. So it seems that she was the kind of woman that if you could prove it to her from the Word, she was going to take it.
That's exactly
Not
right.
going to fight it. She's going to go with the Word of God.
And tenacity, nothing discouraged her.
Yes.
They could say any evil, it didn't change her attitude toward them. So she heard something on the wearing of superfluous jewelry. And Mother said, all right, what next? And it all happened in one day, and we were in that first baptism.
Wow.
That's how we came into the church. I had one sister who was fairly handsome, if I can use Elder Mosley's word, and her husband was in the Navy overseas, and she said, no, I'm not going to do it. Why? This is the way my husband remembers me, and this is the way he's going to find me when he comes home. And nobody bothered her. About 6 weeks later, she took her stand and was baptized, and she has become a soul winner of the professional ilk.
Wow.
I've got to ask you, Elder, before Jim picks up the next question. Obviously, your mother had a profound effect on her children,
Yes.
but you did mention that she had siblings that were in ministry.
Yes.
How did they respond to her change?
The uncles thought it was silly. And they called Aunt Minnie in Philadelphia. In those days, you didn't travel a lot. They called her in Philadelphia and said, we need you to go down to Greensboro and see about your sister. She's having strange religious experiences. Aunt Minnie came down, stayed 2 weeks, went back and joined Ebenezer, Seventh Adventist Church. So then they called Aunt Mary, who lived not far away in Pittsboro, North Carolina. Same thing. She came up, went back and joined church. They didn't have, in those days you had segregated churches.
Yes.
There was no black church. So she joined the white church. And I was down there 2 years ago to preach in that church. And the pastors and the people remembered her. She's passed, of course. And they said such wonderful things about the quiet Christian lady who was Mary Ramsey.
And that was at Pittsburgh.
Pittsboro, North Carolina.
Yes.
And after that, nobody else dared come and check.
The brothers never showed up.
Never showed up. That's the truth.
Yeah, if they had,
And never were reconciled to it.
Is that so?
I understand.
I did mention my father. He was a strong man, known for his truthfulness and his character everywhere. Remember, Depression.
Yes.
There were no A&Ps, no giant supermarkets in those days, not where I lived. There were small stores, and there was G.P. Ross's store, who sold all kinds of things with gasoline. And we could go there, and all you do is sign a little slip, and it was because people were working for $1 a day. One day I went to that store to get something, and he was busy talking to another gentleman about business. He didn't even see me come in. And I went in the back to get down some things that I wanted, and I guess I was about 9, and I heard him complaining that he's carrying a whole drawer full of credit people who won't keep their word. He said, I know at times are hard, and I know we have to help each other, but if they would just do what they say. Now, I'm back there listening, and all of a sudden he made this comment. He said, you know, there's a colored man that lives down this highway about 2 miles, has a large family. His name is Bob Brooks. He said, if everybody would just do what Brooks does, I could make it and they could make it.
Wow.
Wow. I'm a little child. I've never forgotten that.
No.
And I said that day, I want to be like that.
That's right.
One day, I got a call to the ministry, and I wanted to go off to study, and my daddy wanted me to stay home. I'm running ahead a little bit here of the story, I guess. And
Well, did you always plan to be a minister?
oh no, even though I was always interested in the church, I didn't want to be a minister. I think I was shy. I think that
With
was
all these ministers in your background, you would think it would be in the blood, you know?
I think it was. I just didn't want to do it.
And when we look at your life, you seem so gifted for ministry.
Yes.
That'll be such a natural fit, but it wasn't your first love.
No, I wanted to be in the medical profession, but to be honest with you, I didn't want to deal with trauma and blood all the time. So with 3 of my classmates, I graduated from high school at 16, and 3 of them and I got together and discussed this thing. We were still poor, everybody's poor. And they were offering a very effective pre-dentistry program at A&T University. We decided to apply and study together, hang together, and become dentists. So this was settled. We graduated from high school, and I was 2 weeks from matriculating. 2 weeks. I have the letter of acceptance in my file in my basement at home right now. The A&T wrote me and said, we can't give you housing, but you're welcome to the program. So with 2 weeks to go, on a Saturday night, a bunch of us fellows were just walking and enjoying the evening. And at around 7 o'clock, our habit was usually to go call on a little girl. There was one fellow amongst us who didn't have a girl, and nobody wanted to get stuck with him. So they began to whisper to me that they were going to just disappear. And I couldn't do that. So I got stuck with him. Now what am I going to do? I can't take him with me. And I remember Earl Cleveland was running his second effort on Ash Street. He and I went over there. We never missed another night. And immediately, both our lives began to change. On Sundays, rather than joining the crowd for the theater and the dancing, we would saddle horses and ride them all day. And Dad liked that because it exercised his prizes.
Yes.
And he joined the church. He was I call him the first soul the Lord let me win. But on a Sabbath, I was sitting in Cleveland's tent all by myself. Beautiful day. And we had had this tremendous morning, and I'm sitting there, and here comes this. Now, I need to make it clear, I don't hear voices. I have always received such strong impressions.
Yes.
They were like voices. And it came upon me, and it said, Charles, this is what I want you to do, and I will help you to make truth clear. And I'm looking at an empty pulpit, but I could visualize, I don't see things either, but I could visualize myself in a big tent at a pulpit preaching. He didn't tell me to match Cleveland. Nobody does that.
No.
He just told me to do what he does. Well, I thought I was just having a good reverie because it'd been a great Sabbath, and the people started to come back, and it dissipated. I got on the bus and started home, and when I got off that bus and started that long walk to our country home, it came again. Remember, this is what I want you to do, and I will help you.
Did that frighten you at all? Did it disturb you?
No, it didn't frighten me. I kept thinking, after this wears off, it won't come back. When I got home with my family, nothing. I went to bed, and I didn't dream about it. But Sunday morning, as soon as my eyes opened, boom. Now I began to wonder, what is this? It was Tuesday when I met Mother in the kitchen and told her what I've just told. She said, son, when you were born, I gave you to the Lord. Now he's calling you. The thing that disappointed me was I thought she would shout or cry or something. She went right on about her business.
Yeah, it was settled for her, see, years
Yeah.
ago.
So
that's to you.
That's when you got to figure out how someone as poor as I could go away to a boarding school
Right.
and study ministry. So I approached my dad, and by this time they're getting older and didn't have money. And Dad said, son, I have no objection to what you want to do, but why don't you study at A&T? I tried to explain that I couldn't because I had to study a peculiar message. He said, well, your brother-in-law studied there, and that's true. And so I kept trying to explain. He said, well, let me tell you what it's all about. He said, I had 7 daughters and 4 sons, and you are my last boy. As we get older, it would be comforting just to have you at home. And I answered that too. And he finally said, listen, if you stay home, I'll buy you a car. Now, he didn't mean a new car. I didn't know anyone who had a new car. But offering me a car of any kind was like offering me a Cessna. And when I responded that I didn't have that option, he railed. He said, all right, go. Do what you got to do. But I'll not give you a dime. Do you understand that? Not a dime. So I thanked him and walked away. And I remember saying, Lord, I believe you called me. And I've said yes. Now, these are things you're going to have to do. I don't know what to do. I got less than 2 weeks before the kids are leaving. Cleveland baptized a bunch of them who were all going down there. And they were veterans, didn't have monetary problems, and I was not a veteran.
Right.
And so with just a few days to go, I had resigned myself. You'll have to stay home a year and work, and then you'll have to go on your own. And Sabbath morning, before the young people were leaving on Tuesday, on that Sabbath morning, I came down to speak to Mother. She had a prayer room. We had a big house, a prayer room around there. And I went, and there she was, rejoicing. I said, what? What is this? She said, have you seen your dad? I said, no. She said, go find him. And I went into their room, and Dad had a blue suit and a white shirt and a tie on and a baptismal bundle.
Oh, my soul.
And hadn't told a soul.
Oh, man.
We go to church, and Cleveland is baptizing about 125 that day. And the baptistry was in the floor of the rostrum. So when Dad came in, I walked up out of the audience and stood at the foot of that pool. I'm going to see every bit of this.
Oh, yeah.
And Dad was baptized. And that evening, they announced they were having a huge social, everybody involved, but particularly for the young people leaving for college. And so Dad walked up to me right at sunset outside the church. He said, son, are you going to this? I said, well, I hadn't thought about it. And I hadn't. I thought I had had enough blessing for one day.
Yeah.
And he said these words, well, you're going to Oakwood, aren't you? That was the way he capitulated. And on Tuesday, I went to him, and he took out his wallet, and he didn't thumb through like we do. By the way, I didn't know anybody who had a bank account either.
Yeah.
Didn't make enough for that. You needed immediate access.
Yeah.
So they carried it on their hips.
Yeah.
And Dad opened his wallet, and he reached in like this and handed it to me, $310.
Bless
Wow.
his heart.
And I went off to Oakwood with all my fees and everything intact. 4 years later, I graduated. I owed them $75, paid that immediately, and here I am. And Dad was in the church, became deacon, head deacon, elder
Praise God.
in the Lord's church.
Powerful story.
Wow.
God was
It
good.
is. Well, then this was what all took place right after your high school on to Oakwood.
Yes.
And then you got a call to go out into the work?
When, yes, after graduation, in those days, the regional conferences were new.
Yes.
And they certainly,
Yeah,
yes.
because, you know, pops in my mind, usually, not always, after you spend 3 or 4 years at Oakwood College, you come out with a little baggage. Did you meet anybody while you were in school? Not always, but many times you do.
Well,
Yeah.
I want to tell all who are listening, that's a good place to go if you want to do that.
That's right.
I worked the first year on a dairy, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, I was about that work. And 3 o'clock in the evening, I was about that work. 3 to 7 in the morning, 3 to 7 in the evening, and I carried 16 hours of classwork.
Wow.
If you think that's easy, try it.
Yeah.
But there was one meeting I missed by that schedule, and that's every day. And that meeting was Sabbath morning, early morning prayer meeting. Now, you couldn't attend if you're going to do that. But that was the only meeting you were not required in my day to attend. They took the roll. But on that Sabbath morning meeting, nobody checked the roll. You go voluntarily because you left in the darkness. And one day I went to that meeting after I finished with the dairy experience and was shocked to see so many young people who got up when they didn't have to, attending such a meeting. And we had sort of been told, you men, you want to have God on your side when you choose a mate, and if you do that, then you ought to wait a while until you're upperclassmen and you can be serious. And I remember sitting in there looking at that and being so impressed. And I said to myself, when the time comes, I think I want to look amongst this group.
Yes.
That was a good place to look.
A good place to look. And do you know, the young lady that became my wife was in that group with her roommate every Sabbath morning, volunteering. But that didn't do it. She had a niece and a nephew, twins, niece and nephew, and she would help her sister-in-law with one of them. And one day she brought the little child out, and it could not be comforted. I was an usher in charge of clearing the lobby of the church, and so I walked over and said, let me try. And I picked up the little baby and walked out in the beautiful September sunshine. And before I could go very far, the child was snoring in my ear. So I came back and I volunteered to walk the child home with her to put it in the crib. I did that.
That's a nice move, Elder.
Yes.
Wasn't that
smooth.
wonderful? And when I came out of there, here comes that impression again.
Yeah.
When I came out of there it came.
Yes.
That's the
That's the
one.
one.
She told me later that she told her roommate, I think I've met someone I could be happy with.
Yeah.
We have no doubt, after 55 years of marriage, that God was in it.
Praise
Amen.
God. Praise God.
And you know, if somebody is going to be choosing a wife, they need to be praying about that.
Absolutely.
And and start praying before you start looking.
Yes.
Because it's amazing that sometimes you'll try to pray after you think you've already found, and
that's
you
true.
want God's affirmation. You want Him leading that person to you.
I should say.
And He led.
And it's so important. I used to lecture to young people, and I would explain there are only 4 important things you do in all your life. And naturally, that got their attention. The first one is to be born. If you're never born, you don't have to worry about it. That leaves 3. The second one is to be born again. What profiteth it a man if he gain the whole world, lose his soul? The third one is to get married, and the last one is to die. You've got to do those 4 things well, or you haven't lived.
That's right.
And I wish people would think first and then let the heart follow.
Yes.
Yeah, that's good counsel.
It is.
That's good counsel.
Well, you met your wife.
Yeah.
And you got married. You graduated from Oakwood.
Not in that order.
Not in that order.
No, I graduated first. And I was out a year by myself. The worst year of my life.
Well, yeah. Lonely, huh?
Yes.
And you were out in ministry a year before you married.
That's right. Yeah.
Where were you?
I was in Wilmington, Delaware, Chester, Pennsylvania. That was a district.
Yes.
And pretty soon I was also in southwest Philadelphia.
Okay.
Small churches.
Right.
Immediately we got into evangelism.
You started holding meetings.
Yes.
Where was your first meeting?
Well, the first one, I was tent master for Elder J.G. Dasent, an old-fashioned fire and brimstone prophecy preacher.
Yeah.
Oh, you had to learn if you were with him. And you had responsibility. He had me up in the pulpit. He gave me subjects like the charging he-goat and the battering ram of Daniel's vision. And that was my topic.
Wow.
And,
That's heavy meat for just out of the, just out of school.
but he was that way. He encouraged you, and I learned a lot from him. Then the next year, Cleveland was going to do a field school of evangelism in our general area, and about 7 or 8 of the young men were going. So I went in to ask why I wasn't told I was going. And the president said to me, we want you to run your own meeting.
Wow.
So I did. In Chester, Pennsylvania was my first meeting. And I used to lecture to preachers, young ones, and I would say, we doubled our membership. And they would look at me in awe until I said we only had 22 members.
Right.
But what a great meeting, and a small town.
Yes.
And there was a minister there of the elitist church. All the professionals practically went to his church. And he was not far from me. And in those days, you ran at least 8 weeks. And after a week or two, people began to tell me that every Sunday his subject is whatever I've just covered. He's straightening it out.
Right.
And that was okay. Nothing you can do about that. So one day someone came to me and said, Pastor, do you understand he is responding every week to your... doesn't that make you nervous? You're just a kid. And I said, well, no, it doesn't. Why doesn't it make you scared? I said, because I don't have to make mine up.
Yeah, right.
All I have to do is preach the word and let him go on like that. And I'm not, you really have to believe me, I do not rejoice in this. I'm simply reporting history. He decided about halfway through my meeting to buy a tent and put it up and invite the public. Brand new tent. And a week or two later, a terrible storm tore through there. Now, it's one thing to have a tent, it's another thing to know how to care for one. And we had been thoroughly taught that. So I'm out there naked from the waist up with a pick and a shovel and opening up drainage and tightening ropes. In those days, you didn't have the nylon ropes. You had the regular hemp or cotton, and you had to tighten it and then loosen it. Otherwise, it would pull the stakes out of the ground. He didn't understand that, his people, and it destroyed their tent. And I found out about it because I was finishing up some work out there, digging and carrying on, and he drove up in a limousine, and he was in the back seat, and all he did was look out the window. He was trying to figure out what kept my tent up in the air. But we had a wonderful experience in that first effort.
Yeah. Elder, obviously you and E.E. Cleveland go way back to your pre-college days, or during your college days. So just the effect that he had on your early ministry, because you can't hardly sit under Cleveland and not be impacted greatly.
That's the truth.
By his
See,
preaching.
as a child, I had been very spiritual. Got into high school, became worldly. Now, that doesn't mean drugs and gang banging, and we didn't do that. The biggest problem was staying with the crowd and going to the movies and all that. And it begins to take the edge off, of course. Cleveland came to town in 1946, and he's, you know how Cleveland is. My buddy, he said, strong word. Don't show up. My tent isn't big enough to help you. So no church members were allowed to come. But the next year, he had better facilities, a lot more room, and we were invited to come, and that joins the story of me taking this young man there. By the way, that young man became head deacon, and he passed. I eulogized him, and his wife and children are still in the church, offices of the church.
Praise God.
So Cleveland is running this meeting, and I go there just to have something to do with my buddy, and I listened. I had never heard anything like it in my life. He tells me now, he says, Charlie, I was mean in those days. he came slashing and cutting, you know. But I was deeply, deeply impressed. Plus, he baptized my daddy, and I'd never heard anything like that. So we became friends. And when I went away to college and came home the next year, he had to go to some meeting down in Atlanta. He just wanted me to ride with him. And you can't do that without learning and observing and questioning and talking and being instructed by Earl Cleveland was being instructed by the best.
That's right.
And so I tell you, the impact was, great, and still is. I never sit under him that I don't learn something.
Yes.
True for all of us.
You know it.
And true that when we sit under you, we learn from you.
Oh, my.
And I remember that we were at Berkshire together, and I had a lot of different ways of building my crowd, and some of the other evangelists said, share some of those ways with us. And I was talking about using gifts and things of that nature, and I'll never forget, you said, I get up, here's how I build my crowd. I get up and I get into the Word early in the morning, and I study, and then he said I take a rest in the afternoon for a little bit, and when I get to that pulpit that night, I'm on fire, and it builds the crowd. And I'll never forget that. I learned from that.
Is that right?
Yes, I did.
All right.
I learned from that.
I think that one of the as we look back over your career, when I was a senior at Oakwood College, there was a sermon you preached called "The Age of Methuselah," which
Long time ago.
which our whole senior class pirated from you.
Is
I
that
think
right?
Everybody in the graduate class preached "Age of Methuselah" at one time.
He's
in their premiere.
still growing.
He's still growing. But I think the gift that God gave you was to take the gospel and make it plain,
Yes.
and make it very profound, but make it very plain. And if you talk about gifts, when you say C.D. Brooks, it's the idea that you can take that which is complex and maybe even a little difficult and make it very plain and very understandable and very profound in its plainness, so that the college-educated person can get something from it. The high school teacher can get something from it. The maid who has never gone to school can get something from it, and they all come blessed. And I think that's a particular gift that God has given you.
Those are very kind words, and if that happens, it is a gift, and I would always want to give God the glory for everything like that. I'd be afraid to take credit for anything. I've never spent 5 minutes on style, how you say it, and when you emphasize and when you don't. That's not wrong, it's just that I've never done that. And so I thank God if that has happened and ordained.
I have had a good friend. He's passed away when he was in his 40s, but
Yes.
his name was Phil Huber. He got a set of your tapes. He was driving across the country on a long trip, and he listened to every one of your tapes. And then he borrowed every one of your sermons. He became a conference evangelist.
Oh.
And he preached your sermons, even sometimes with your very tonations of your voice. I would tease him a little bit and about that. But God has used you to inspire young preachers.
Bless the Lord.
And this young preacher, Phil Huber, preached your messages over and over again. And the Lord gave him hundreds and hundreds of baptisms.
I had made this statement once that, first of all, I go back to a man who was invited to by me to speak to our union session. We had a ministerial department there, and he spoke to that ministerial group on methodology, preaching methodology, and Dr. Beats. And he said in that meeting, whatever you hear or see that impacts your heart is yours.
Yeah, that's great.
Don't worry about borrowing. We're trying to get the word out.
Yes.
And I remember following up with these words that drew a laugh, but I was dead serious. One of the problems in ministry today is we're all striving to be original and succeeding.
Yeah. Yeah. And those who have really grown in ministry started emulating somebody.
That's true.
And
yes.
then they grow.
Yeah,
Yes.
and then they grow. Chester, PA. Then we've got the C years, dare we call them? Camden, Columbus, Cleveland. So you had a succession of charters and meetings.
They moved me a lot in those days. They called them promotions, but if you dislike moving as much as I do, you wonder. But I never questioned the brethren when they made such decisions. And in all of these places, you have unique and wonderful experiences. I think of one in Camden. This was called the Garden State. They prepared and sold more frozen vegetables than perhaps any other state.
That's Camden, New Jersey.
Yeah. And this brought in lots of people to do that kind of labor. And there was a Portuguese man, a strict Catholic, who lived on a plantation like that, and his neighbors were Adventists. So being lonely, he came to church all the time with him. And after a while, I kept wondering why he doesn't respond. Why can't we baptize this man? And he was quiet and gentle and kind, but he never seemed impressed with anything. So we started a campaign in our church because the city wouldn't let me put up my tent. And I preached on the mark of the beast, Jim.
Oh, yeah.
I preached on the mark of the beast, no holds barred, but as kindly as I could. And when I went to the door to shake hands with all these people going out, I saw him coming, and I wondered what he would say. Truth is not against people. It's against error. It's against darkness. And I want that to go across. And finally he got to the door, and he took my hand and looked me dead in the eye. He said, Pastor, that does it for me. So on the toughest subject of all,
Yeah.
he made a decision and joined the church.
Praise God.
Wow.
Camden was good.
Well, I know that we both really enjoyed doing that interview, and now we're enjoying watching it again. And
It is a pleasure to watch it.
it
really
is.
Yeah.
And this man who has such a great wealth of experience, and God has blessed him in so many ways, and eventually he became the speaker for Breath of Life.
Yeah, yeah. You can see from that first hour, Jim, he came from good stock. He had a solid dad.
Yeah.
Who was a honest person, had a reputation in the community, and the kind of mother he had that if he could show it to me from the Word,
Yes.
I'm ready to go with it.
That's right.
Just give me from the Word, and I'll go with it.
And you know, folks, you just can't beat that. If you have children, be a good parent. Be a solid citizen. It is so important.
Yeah.
Because, you know, it's not our teaching them. They say it's not what they're taught, it's what they've caught.
Sure.
That really matters. And growing up with these kind of parents, he really did catch the right vision.
C.D. obviously watched his parents, modeled himself after, respected his parents, and yet he always had that sense of his calling. And he knew who he was in Christ, and he knew that Christ had a calling on his life.
The amazing thing is the way that Elder Cleveland's life is wrapped around his, where in that meeting, he hears the call of God.
Yes, yes, yes.
And steps out and becomes a minister.
Isn't that something?
When he was not really planning on being a minister. You know, God has plans for our lives sometimes that we know nothing of.
Isn't that something?
And in fact, I would be a little bit surprised if you or I, either one, had thought we were going to end up being with 3ABN.
Right.
But God led in this way. Well, listen, you stay by with us because we're going to be back for a whole nother hour of this interview with Elder C.D. Brooks. And you're going to hear some exciting things about some of the meetings he's held and about the beginning of the Breath of Life ministry.
And I can't find him. So I don't know what to expect. And I turn around to run to his train, and I run right into him. You know, smack right into him. And of course, he's kind and gracious.
Yeah.
And I was ready for an explosion. And of course, he was just CD.
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
he said, CA, it's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Yeah.
I know the trains got rerouted. Right. And I saw that mass of people. I said, how's they ever going to find us in this train station with thousands of people? But he was gracious and kind. And he gave a fine, godly interview, as you recall.
Oh, very much so. And I reminded him of a time we were at Berkshire years ago with all the different evangelists, and we were talking about ways of increasing attendance and holding the attendance that you get. And different individuals were talking about, like the Bible gift plan, and others had things that they gave away. I made a presentation on something that I was giving away. I remember that. Elder Brooks simply looked at us when we said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I get on my knees with the Word of God."
Yes.
And he said, "I pray and I study." And he said, "I am so on fire when I hit that pulpit that people come night by night to watch this preacher burn."
Yes.
With the power of the Holy Spirit. And so it was a chastisement a little bit to those of us, but I have never forgotten that. And it made a big impression upon me to spend more time in study, more time in prayer, and depending more on the Holy Spirit for the results that we have.
Well, not only was he the speaker for Breath of Life for many, many years, but of course he held evangelistic crusades.
Oh, yes.
And there are a number of churches around the country that are Breath of Life churches that are a result of meetings that he had.
True, and also correct, as a friend of mine says. And, and you know that some of those churches have just grown profoundly. And he's going to be sharing some of those experiences with us in our interview. I will never forget that day. There are some days that, you know, just kind of melt into all the others and you don't recall them. But I'll never forget that day just because we had that opportunity to visit with this man.
Yeah, beautiful new church, you recall. and your wife and Walter Ian Brooks were sitting, and a couple pastors came. They just heard that C.D. Brooks was going to be interviewed, and they just appeared.
Yes.
And they became our audience that day, but it was a fabulous interview.
It was. And you know, the amazing thing to me is that when these men have completed and come down to the twilight years of their ministry, Elder Brooks, Elder Cleveland, Elder Bradford, so many times our leaders kind of melt off into the sunset. We never hear from them again. Mm-hmm. I'm so thankful. Say, well, that person is so humble, and there may be a terrible pride within him. Mm-hmm. But in Elder Brooks, we see a humility that was willing to put himself on the line. Go out there in an evangelistic meeting and put that poster out. Your influence is on the line. Everything is on the line. And you go into a place, hold a meeting, knowing that these meetings can totally fail and you can be an embarrassment. But he would go time after time again, and God would bless him in those meetings.
The thing that impresses me about Elder Brooks, of course, I've known him a number of years, as have you.
Yes.
He did a great meeting in New York in 1992 in Brooklyn. But when we had him come to New York City, you flew in, I flew in, we were there, and I picked him up at the train station. Now, we brought him into to Grand Central Station, New York City.
Right.
Humongous train station. And the problem was that 3 trains came in at the same time. One was delayed because of a storm. His train and the train behind him actually was early. So all 3 trains came in. And they were changing tracks because they had to reroute trains. So I'm looking on a board trying to find C.D. Brooks, his train, and they switched tracks. So I'm at this track over here, and of course he is over there. And by the time I get to the station master to find out, he's been in the station maybe 15, 20 minutes. Well, I'm thinking, oh boy, he's there with his wife, running around this massive train station, thousands of people.
Well, we've been running a very special series. We are calling it the Heritage Series, where we are talking to those who we know that God has used greatly in the spreading of the gospel. This message of the 3 angels has gone around the world. It's continuing to go around the world. And some of these individuals that we are talking to have been those that have really been right on the cutting edge of proclaiming the gospel. And the one we're going to be speaking to today is Elder C.D. Brooks. Wonderful man, isn't he, C.A.?
He is an extremely godly man. Now, of the 3, this is the 3rd in our series. We've had E.E. Cleveland, powerful man of God, as you well know. And Elder Bradford was just talking with him just yesterday, and he was saying the amount of calls and cards and well wishes he got when we aired his particular life story, which was powerful because his mother, as he said, knew Ellen White and was on the Morning Star boat with Edson. Now we come to C.D. Brooks, and the thing that jumps out at you about Elder Brooks is his humility. He is a humble guy, and I was reading just yesterday where Ellen White was saying to have ability without humility doesn't really make you a powerful tool in the hand of God. It's the ability and the humility combined that makes you a force for God. And this is a man who combines great ability with great humility.
And this is genuine humility.
Yes.
Not the phony type.
No.
You know, we can't always spot the phony type, but God can. And genuine humility may be a very outgoing person. I know of individuals, and I can name some, that are just so open and wide and outgoing, and people might look at them and think they're not humble. But if they really knew them, they know that they are genuinely,
Yes.
have a genuine humility.
Yes.
And someone else may be very quiet and very staid and sit back, and you may